Hi, Damon.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good.
Well, good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show on Blogging Heads TV. You are Damon Linker, very well-known journalist. You write numerous columns per week, at The Week, which is an interesting publication in its own right. I've always been kind of impressed by its persistence. I mean, because it showed up. I don't know. It showed up some time ago. I mean, it was certainly originally an actual physical publication, right? I don't know if it still is.
It is, and actually it does quite well with circulation. It's pretty successful. It's largely a digest of the news, so there's not a lot of original journalistic content in it. It kind of has non-byline, summary, capsule overviews of the news, opinion, the arts, and so forth. So kind of like a Reader's Digest for the news for the 21st century. And then the website is all original content, and that's where I do my business.
Well, the idea behind the magazine is probably something like the original idea behind Time Magazine. I mean, Time Magazine evolved, but I think it originally was a little more in the way of summary. There were no bylines. This was like 100 years ago, of course. But anyway, the Week has done very well. It's a real presence on the web as well as in paper. So I thought I would have you on and talk to you about, well, certainly Trumpism, and I guess given recent events, James Comey. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you if you want to characterize your ideology, because I think, I'm not sure I have a clear fix on it, except to say that it doesn't fit readily into the most conventional kind of taxonomies. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. It's very hard to characterize my ideology because if I were asked, as you just have, to describe it, I would have to say I define myself as trying to avoid ideology as much as possible. And what you end up with, if you read my columns regularly, is a kind of portrait of my somewhat non-ideological mind making its way through the world, responding to different events as they happen as I see them, not doing what ideology often does, which is the sociologist Daniel Bell once had a kind of series of metaphors in which he talked about how ideology is like a machine where you put in your coins and you kind of get a ready-made answer for anything. And I find that irritating about ideology and kind of distortive of the world and one's thinking. So you can certainly characterize where I come down on issues. I mean, but not in ideological terms very easily. So, for instance, on economic issues, I'm sort of pragmatic but lean center-left, and I'm open to more kind of socialistic directions of things, depending on the moment. I certainly am more so now in response to the mood in the country and the Western world. And then on kind of cultural and social issues, I am personally, pretty secular in my outlook, and I'm not a social conservative, but I'm very respectful of social conservative attitudes and think that liberals should be more open to them. And so I frequently find myself writing columns in which I'm chastising liberals for being too intolerant of more conservative social views. And then, on foreign policy, I'm really kind of off the map because I'm sort of so far left that I'm right, or vice versa. And then I've been a big critic of basically all military interventionism in the Middle East since the Iraq War, which I opposed before it started.
Hey,
and at the
time, me too, brother. There aren't a lot of us.
I know, and especially at the time, I was very much ensconced in the conservative world as an editor at First Things magazine, and that was not a popular stance to take.
Well, it wasn't that popular in liberal circles either. Where I am, but there you go. So you mentioned First Things. Now that is thought of as I gather, conservative religious magazine, and your two books have been kind of about religion, right? One was called The Religious Test, Why We Must Question the Beliefs of Our Leaders, and then
The first one was the Theocons.
The Theocons.
Yeah.
Secular America Under Siege.
Right.
So, I mean, is there a reason for? I mean, how you described your orientation as secular, and yet you were at First Things. That
Well,
would
I
seem
did
ironic to some people.
my story is complicated. I went through a period where I was more personally religious when I was in my 30s, and that coincided with getting the job at First Things. It kind of started shortly before I got that job, and I tried for several years to fit in at First Things, and had certain affinities with their kind of deep philosophical orientation. I mean, I am kind of classically philosophical in the sense that I think philosophy is a great way to live, to kind of question everything. And I do think that part of that process involves raising the big questions of life, the meaning of questions about love, friendship, justice, death, God, and so forth. And First Things is a magazine about first questions, first things. And so even though I was not very religious, I was kind of skeptically religious, curiously religious, interested in cultivating some of that to see if I could fit in with it, and it made sense to me. I felt comfortable at that time among people on staff who were more pious themselves. But this began to fall apart with the Iraq War, with the kind of the church scandal, with the priests accused of molesting children and so forth, and then other things that grew out of those conflicts on the staff. So that by the time we got to, say, late 2004, I no longer fit in at the magazine. And believe me, trying to be at that point, I was the editor of the magazine, frequently clashing with the editor-in-chief, Richard John Newhouse. And let me tell you, being the editor of an opinion journal when you don't agree with the opinions can get really awkward.
Yeah.
So that led to big blow up. I quit, wrote the Theocons about what I saw at the time as the kind of pernicious influence of the circle of intellectuals of the magazine on the Bush administration.
Okay.
So that's the complicated story.
Okay. Yeah, I was acting editor of the New Republic when Marty Peretz was owner and editor-in-chief, so I can empathize with the situation he faced.
There are a lot of
many people who have been editors of magazines can. So I said we'd talk a little, at least, about the James Comey firing. So what's your take on that?
Well, I see that as the latest example of Trump being a disaster as a human being. This is the weird thing we have at the moment with the Trump administration is, on the one hand, you have the Republican Party in Congress, which is doing exactly what they would be doing with any other Republican president, which is enacting this extremely far-right agenda that has been formed, since Reagan, but getting progressively more radical, first under Gingrich in the 90s, and then once Obama won. I mean, basically every time you get a Democratic president, the kind of Reagan Republican coalition lurches further right. And ironically, often in response to the Democrats kind of clicking a few steps to the right. So Clinton comes in, he signs welfare reform, he does NAFTA, and how do the Republicans respond? Not by saying, ha, see how influential we've been? No, they say, oh yeah, well, we're going to go even further. And then Obama comes in and he champions the Affordable Care Act, which is modeled on Mitt Romney's health care plan in Massachusetts. And do the Republicans respond by saying, yay, we won the health care debate? No, they respond by saying, we need a free market in health care and nothing else is acceptable. Anything else is tyranny. The end of freedom in America. So in Congress now, you have that happening with the passage of the AHCA last week through the House, which it was kind of surprised that it finally passed, the kind of so-called repeal and replace bill. But then you also have Trump in the White House, which presents a completely different universe of problems. The fact that by temperament, the man is kind of an authoritarian, but then also by temperament, the guy is incapable of kind of focusing on and executing anything other than responding to his own pathological insecurity and anger about people who don't just do what he wants. And so the Comey firing is the ultimate example of the latter, which had kind of receded over the last few weeks, but now it burst again here on Tuesday. He up and fires the FBI director who is leading the primary one of several investigations of interactions and possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia and the Russian intelligence services. And Trump is like the only human being inside the Washington Beltway who would not instantly recognize that this would blow up and make the problem of this investigation 1,000 times worse. So that's why, in some ways, the Comey firing is the greatest confirmation we've had yet that Trump as a human being is just a disaster. He can't even rationally calculate his own self-interest, as an economist might put it. He kind of, all he sees is I don't like this investigation. I can't control it. Comey's driving me crazy. I got to get rid of him. And then he does it without even being able to see, understanding the political situation, that if he does that, he's going to be credibly accused of obstruction of justice, which suddenly magnifies the problem.
Now that's interesting, because I think, oddly, in a certain sense, what you've just articulated is the White House's preferred interpretation. What I mean by that is, like, initially, a lot of people concluded, as I more or less did, that, look, if he's willing to put up with the blowback he's going to get and the complications he's going to get from firing Comey, Comey must have been close to getting to some kind of uncovering some kind of smoking gun or something. There's something deep that he has to hide that Comey was closing in on. That's the only explanation. But, of course, that is a kind of a rational actor explanation. The assumption there is that he can anticipate the consequences, and he's calculated that, on balance, they are worth it. And that was my initial interpretation. And I still think there's a pretty good chance that captures a lot of what's going on. And I say that as somebody who's actually been a skeptic of the whole Russia thing. I mean, I have not thought that there was much more than we've already seen to that. And I kind of have thought that a lot of sleazy stuff involving people who used to work for Trump and so on, but I kind of didn't think there was any grand conspiracy, and if there was, that there wouldn't be any smoking gun. But when he fired Comey, I started rethinking. But then, lately we've had a wave of stories, like a big one in the Washington Post, where the narrative is very much as you described. They depict this guy who had been getting annoyed by various things Comey did. His rage is building. He wanted Comey to defend him when he claimed that Obama tapped Trump Tower. There was this and that. And, Comey was obnoxious in his testimony to Congress. And it just boiled over. And finally, he blew a fuse and said, I'm firing the director of the FBI. And when these stories came out with that narrative, which is kind of like yours, people,
And by the way, my narrative is based on having read those very same newspaper reports, so I'm sort of relying on the reporting.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of people are, and in fact, a common reaction to those stories was, wow, this White House is so amazing how leaky it is, all this derogatory information about Trump just flooding out. But then I thought, actually, this is the best narrative for them. I'm not sure that this isn't an orchestrated set of leaks to some extent, because it's either this or he tried to derail an investigation that was closing in on him. And it's actually better for the White House to sustain this idea that he's just this crazy guy. And it could be, it's plausible. I'm torn between the two narratives, I have to tell you, because they both are plausible in their own way.
Well, let me make the case for the narrative that I laid out, which I do think is the more likely one. First of all, about Trump's motives, maybe he thought, ultimately, why did he hate the Russia investigation? Because at some level, he must fear that they're going to find something that's going to hurt him. And so at a kind of second order level, what you're saying might still be the ultimate motive behind why he was so angry at Comey and ultimately fired him. But I do think there's a lot of evidence to back up the way I described it, in the way the Post, the Politico had a big piece yesterday, and then the Times, also this morning, the New York Times, all of them kind of pushing the line I laid out. And I think it really meshes very closely with what we've seen from Trump's behavior across a whole bunch of things. Why on earth did Donald Trump bomb Syria a few weeks ago? The guy who made such waves in his campaign and actually almost every day of his administration, except for that one day, as this kind of newfangled America First ultra, not isolationist, but kind of totally skeptical of alliances, of anything like liberal international moral imperatives guiding foreign policy, has no interest in that whatsoever. One day he up and bombs Syria. Why? Well, it appears because his daughter came in and made a kind of sob story case about the poor kids who died from the chemical attack. And so he goes and impulsively launches whatever it was, 59 missiles, Tomahawk missiles at Syria. Nothing before that made coherent strategic sense to explain it, and after it was never followed up by anything to make it seem reasonable. It was an impulsive decision, which is how everything is. You see it again also with healthcare.
Okay, but before you get to healthcare, can I just say there's an alternative interpretation of Syria strike, and this one I actually hold a little more firmly than I hold any particular interpretation in the case of Comey, which is that, again, it is kind of a rational calculation hypothesis, but the Syria strike, I admit it doesn't fit into his professed ideology, but whoever thought that any coherent ideology would be sustained by Trump? I mean, what I think it does make sense as is political calculation. I mean, this comes amid a lot, it came amid a lot of publicity about the Russia thing, and Trump is in the service of the Russians and so on, and I think this could be seen by Trump as doing two things, the Syria strike. One is, I don't believe the idea was to change the subject, as a lot of people said. I don't think that, but I do think it went very counter to the narrative that he is in the service of the Russians. It was a way of showing that he would stand up to the Russians because they hated these strikes. So it worked against that narrative. And he could also have hoped, I mean, in the end, he didn't get any kind of Gallup boost, any kind of approval rating boost out of this, but he could have plausibly hoped that, in general, when there's conflict, a president benefits from a kind of a rally around the flag effect. Like, yeah, you're tough. So I thought Syria actually made sense as plausible political calculation, and that the more kind of official narrative of, oh, they showed him these pictures of babies, I mean, that just doesn't sound like Trump to me. I don't think he's a deeply empathetic person. Now, his daughter may have a lot of influence with him, but I just don't see him, tearing up over anything in particular.
Well, what you say could make sense if it were almost anybody else. I don't. If your account made sense, I think we would have seen it having some continuity, even for a week or two, that somehow our policy that it would be followed up, not necessarily by more strikes immediately, but a more aggressive attempt to intervene in the Civil War to bring about a conclusion. It's like, if you look, I mean, it's true that he didn't get any Gallup boost, but where he did get a boost is from kind of center-left commentators who have been, were very upset about Obama not doing anything about it.
And they've been complaining about the Russia connection too. And all of a sudden they were on. I mean, he got praise from all kinds of elite circles he had not gotten. He had gotten only flack from.
But notice, there was no follow-up.
But why should there be?
Yeah, but what good does it do him in the calculative way that you've laid it out if the bounce he gets from it lasts a total of 36 hours and then it's forgotten, like everything else in this presidency? Everything that happens lasts a very short time and then he moves on to another other place. And I don't want to get into the woods on healthcare, but it is striking that this is a guy who in the past has advocated single-payer healthcare. he continued to use the rhetoric through the campaign and after the campaign about how, oh, when we repeal and replace Obamacare, it's going to be great. No one will lose their coverage. It'll be wonderful. Everyone will be covered. And then he says the thing a week or so ago, oh, Australia has such better. He has absolutely one awareness of policy and what healthcare policy is in this country versus other countries. And also, in addition to that ignorance, he has no capacity to think, I think, in politically strategic ways about what it makes sense to say or do from moment to moment. It's amazing. And I think we in the media have a hard time because and not just in the media, but people like us who kind of analyze the world for a living, because we do what we do by way of making coherent sense out of the discrete dots of events. We wrap them in theories that account for what we see. And most people in politics, we don't have to work hard to do that because they kind of wear the ideology on their sleeve. But Trump, I really don't think he does that. And you could almost say, if you read my commentary on Trump over the last several months, basically since he won, you can see me under the surface very slowly coming to ever greater awareness of this and its implications. And I find it disorienting and extremely dangerous because I don't think there's any way to game out what Trump might do from moment to moment, let alone if he felt cornered in an international crisis.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'd say two things. I think I agree with much of what he said. I mean, figuring out this guy's brain is an ongoing challenge. I mean, my wife just sent me this thing where a snippet of an interview he had with The Economist where he was talking about a tax cut and he said, you know, you'd prime the pump. And then all of a sudden, Trump says to the guy interviewing him, he says, have you ever heard that phrase, prime the pump? And the guy actually says yes, because of course we all have heard it in that very context a billion times. And Trump says, it just occurred to me for the first time, and I think it's kind of a nice phrase. What? And then of course people went to the trouble to dig up places where he had used it himself. It's just like, what? You know, every day I have to revise my theory of what the specific cognitive impairments are here. It's so strange. So anyway, I buy a lot of that. Well,
I should say here that a lot of what I just said about kind of Trump's mind, I was groping toward that direction in my commentary, but yesterday, this guy, I just called it up on my phone, David Roberts, who writes for
the
Fox.
Enviro liberal guy,
Yeah. He had a 40 tweets long tweet storm yesterday that I retweeted and has been kind of viral for the last 24 hours. Anyone who's watching this, and you, Bob, yourself, I go to my Twitter stream and dig that up and read that. I mean, he really does a better job than I just did of kind of laying out that in his view, Trump has no theory of mind, which is this notion that people have a kind of orienting heuristic that kind of guides how they view the world, and it gives continuity to their thoughts and actions, and that Trump is a kind of case study in someone who does not have one.
I actually did read that tweet storm because I was led to it by your tweet, and there's two sides of his argument. He's saying on the one hand, I think he's saying Trump is not great at reading other people's minds, but there's a problem in reverse, which is that if you try to read Trump's mind, and you assume there is a mind in there, you're starting off with a flawed premise in the view of Roberts. And I think that's kind of...
That was the point I was making before about you and I and people like us.
Right. You shouldn't use your theory of mind module in trying to appraise Trump. I think it's certainly a weird thing. I think Roberts overstates it. I mean, at one point he says he's all amygdala. I think it's more complicated than that. I have my own theory of Trump that we don't have to get into, but look, he's a weird case. I think if there's a defense of sometimes using a rational actor model to appraise his behavior, the defense lies partly in the fact that he does talk to other people in the administration And those reactions sometimes guide his behavior. He talks to generals about national security strategy. He talks to Wright's previous, Steve Bannon, whatever you think of. I mean, apparently Bannon said, no, don't fire Comey, at least not now. So you can imagine rational behavior.
Roger Stone instead.
What's that? Yeah, I know.
Trump sought out Roger Stone. Well, the one guy who's crazy enough to think this is a good idea, and who is also, by the way, under FBI investigation.
Exactly. Perfectly impartial source of guidance to turn to. Anyway, okay, so let's get into Trumpism more broadly. So, and you know how the phenomenon happened, how you got such a weird guy here, what's the basis of his political support. You wrote a column not long ago called Liberalism's, I think, Self-Defeating. How old was it? And here's and I think this you tuned into one kind of theory that you kind of get about why the basis of some of Trump's support. Actually, you're quoting a previous column, but here's what you had said in your previous column. Over the past several decades, a range of positions on immigration, crime, gender, and the costs and benefits of some forms of diversity have been relegated to the categories of racism, sexism, homophobia, white supremacy, or white nationalism, and therefore excluded from first-order political debate. So I take it you buy the idea that you sometimes hear that Trumpism is to some extent a reaction against liberal political correctness and liberal identity politics.
To some extent. I mean, I think explaining Trumpism is extraordinarily complicated, partly because, as we've seen, even if Le Pen lost in France and the elections recently in Austria and the Netherlands have also been disappointing for populist right-wing candidates, it's still very true that at this moment in history there is a kind of, throughout the West, an international upsurge of support for right-wing populists, sometimes left-wing too. But so there obviously are very complicated things, and in Europe it's really not about identity politics and political correctness at all, or at all in the same way as it might be here. There are economic drivers of it as well that everyone has talked about as well. You know, of course, decline in manufacturing jobs and so forth. All of that matters. There are many other things I won't even get into. But yes, one aspect of it is, in my view at least, that liberalism has an ambition, and you see it here in one form and you see it in the EU in another, but related form, which is this notion that a lot of liberals have that not that their view is a legitimate and defensible position versus other views which are not as good, but we will win that debate in the court of public opinion, but rather that liberalism should be the first order conviction of everyone who lives in a liberal democracy. And those things are different. The first one is a partisan view that accepts give and take and back and forth within the debate of politics in a free society. And it involves having to win an argument with opponents. There's another, it's the second order kind of view that I think is kind of pernicious. It's the kind of thing that leads liberals to be extremely fond of appealing to courts to win debates. That when liberals become frustrated that they're not winning in the court of public opinion, they appeal to a judge and hope that a judge will rule that actually your position, liberals, is the only legitimate position, and you win from now on. Mm-hmm. And those who disagree with you have to take their toys and go home from the playground and just suck it up. And you saw the most kind of vivid example of this is gay marriage, where there was an ongoing back and forth debate about whether gay marriage should be legal, and remarkably, the pro-gay marriage side was winning very quickly. In the court of public opinion, you saw it in Gallup polls, a constant ascending line from year to year, state after state passing laws allowing gay marriage. And if you would allow that process to continue, probably within the next 10 or 15 years, it probably would have been legal in most places. But instead what happened is the Supreme Court weighed in, and when the Supreme Court did, immediately that says to those who are on the other side, you don't get to fight about this anymore. You lose. Bye-bye. It's over. Now, to be a participant in liberal democratic, small l, small d politics in our society, you have to accept that it is a constitutional right that gays can marry. Now, I am pro-gay marriage. I have been for well over a decade now. I cheered when Obergefell came down. So it's not a matter of substantively disagreeing with the decision, and you can even argue that that particular decision was rightly decided, and it's not a good example of the phenomenon, but it's just an example of a broader thing, where liberals are very quick, I think, to fall back to a position that wants to declare those who disagree with them to be illegitimate, not wrong on the substance and deserving of losing the debate. Fair and square, but illegitimate, that you should not be allowed to hold a certain view on immigration, on what the country needs to do to protect itself against Islamic terrorism, about a range of social issues. And that is the dynamic that feeds into political correctness and identity politics.
I mean, don't you think you get any of that from the conservative side? I mean, I think there are a lot of conservatives who think that if you support abortion rights, you favor murder. And it's not something they feel a need to hold a whole seminar on, right? I mean, it's just they say it to each other, they take it for granted, and that is the label they affix to you. And I'm not saying that's any less legitimate than, or more legitimate than when it moves in the other direction. It just seems to me you're describing, I'm wondering if it really is a question of kind of like cognitive styles and definition of what's debatable and not debatable, or just who has the power at a given point, right? Who gets the 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court and who doesn't at any given moment, right?
Well, maybe. I mean, the example of the most strict pro-life view that you just expressed, which is held by maybe 10% of the public, is probably the strongest counter-argument you could offer to what I said, because the claims on the conservative side are so extreme about the liberal side. But I still think that in general that is pretty rare. In my experience, having worked with conservatives and reading conservatives for my whole adult life, I do tend to find that the old Charles Krauthammer line is generally, in most cases, true, that conservatives tend to think liberals are foolish, and liberals tend to think conservatives are evil. And by evil, I mean racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, just basically are cretins morally. And I would also point again to the EU, where in the EU, if you hold certain views against immigration, there are millions and millions of more liberal-minded, and of course they don't call them liberals, but it's different definition, but the left side of the debate views the right side of the debate as basically a bunch of fascist, racist, homophobic, and xenophobic cretins who really have no business getting near political power. They have excommunicated themselves from legitimate argument. And my case is simply, you can't succeed in doing that. That you can try, but those people don't just go away with their toys and go, I give up. They actually wait around and organize, and sometimes they come back, and sometimes they come back worse. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we've seen in the rise of Trumpism here, and then in some of these populist movements, Brexit also in the UK, is the kind of resurgence of things that the left side thought that it had stamped out for good, coming back. And so that's not the answer. The answer is always to try to win the argument on the substance, which liberals are also very good at, because they actually read and study policy in a way that the right sometimes doesn't do at all. And actually, as the conservative movement has degraded over the last decade or so, the number of people on the right who actually have policy chops have decreased. And so we're in a bad case in the moment.
Yeah, it's funny, you quoted that Charles Krauthammer line in your column, and actually what he said is conservatives think liberals are stupid, liberals think conservatives are evil. And when I first saw that, I thought, in some ways, isn't it the other way around? And in fact, what you had just said, the way you paraphrased it, conservatives think liberals are foolish, is, I think, closer to the actual truth. I mean, it seems to me, first of all, the stereotype of the liberal conception of conservatives that is often invoked in evaluating Trump and Trumpism is that people in the heartland, conservatives in the heartland, think that liberals think they're stupid. They hold them in contempt. That is at least something you hear. And meanwhile, on the other side, it seems to me that a lot of conservatives do think liberals are evil. Now, that may be more of a grassroots thing than an elite thing. But I don't know. It just seems to me the picture is in some ways more complicated than the one Charles painted there. And of course, it's fluid. And I think in your column you note that the way the dynamic works at the elite level is not the same as the way it works at the grassroots level.
That's right. I did. It's funny. I added that at the last minute in the final edit because I thought, so someone on the right or on the left, someone on the left is going to call me on this and say, how can you say this? Because look at these the right and how they foam at the mouth about liberals, and they're furious about liberals being evil. And there is a way that the talk radio dynamic, which foments a kind of constant high boil fury among the grassroots on the right, does tend to kind of cut against that more elite level, more intellectual level ideal type that I set up there following Krauthammer.
Yeah. I certainly agree that on the left, some of these basic tenets in realms of race, sexual identity, and so on, have become tenets that are not considered really arguable. And I guess the way I look at it is, I'm kind of ambivalent of that. I think they will someday be seen almost universally as things that aren't arguable. It's like you said, gay marriage was trending toward greater and greater support. And also just as a logical matter, it's like if you agree that people, regardless of race, should be, given due respect, and that racial intermarriage is fine, and so on. A lot of that is kind of logically transferable to these other realms. So that if you buy what was the American consensus 30 years ago about race, why doesn't that translate into a consensus about certain ideas about sex? And I kind of agree with you. Or sexual identity or whatever. It's probably, it is a matter of time, and someday the liberal view that, look, these are basically almost beyond dispute. We're talking about, human rights. Someday that will be the close to universal view. But I think if what you're saying is right, that it's a question of, if what you're saying is that it's a question of how rapidly you can expect people to absorb change and change their views, I agree that there are limits on what you can realistically, and that's true of societal change in general, including demographic change due to immigration.
Yeah, and I think that's all true. I agree with everything you just said, especially the part at the end about the speed of change. I think we have a tendency to, especially among center-left liberals, to neglect the danger of pushing certain kinds of social change too quickly and sparking a reaction. Especially this ends up being futile if you agree, as you and I both do, that in the end we're marching in that direction anyway. Now, I understand where some of it comes from, and it is understandable. Like, if you're a gay couple and you want to get married, it's hard to make the case to them, like, oh, just wait 10 years. We'll catch up to that. When you have the possibility of Anthony Kennedy switching sides or taking a stand with a 5-4 decision and making it happen now. You want that. But if the consequence of it is not just a kind of rolling of the eyes in the American heartland where there are a lot of voters, but actually a kind of priming of the pump for something like a populist reaction led by someone like Donald Trump, who raises all kinds of dangers for this country and being president, then you have a more complicated calculation to make. Another example I wanted to bring up briefly is Tony Judt, the late historian of modern Europe, who was a huge hero of mine. He wrote a great book that hardly anyone has read about 20 years ago called The Grand Illusion, about the EU, the history of it. It's kind of a first take for his great post-war book that came out later, but it's largely about the EU. And he warned in that book that the EU's hurry to erase national affiliations and forms of particular solidarity was priming Europe for a right-wing nationalist reaction to that. That by pushing so hard toward getting rid of national affiliation on the part of citizens, that we were running the risk of conjuring back into existence the very kind of atavistic attachments that led to things like fascism that the EU was created to ensure we'd never have again. And if you accept that analysis, you're left with a position that is much more complicated for people who believe in progress to swallow and live with, which is, in effect, politics is endless trench warfare. It never ends. You can't just erase borders and get rid of nations if you don't have some other political association to replace it with, because maybe human beings need some focal point of attachment larger than, well, just something. It has to be something. City-state, a nation, even an empire in certain situations, this has functioned. But you can't simply say we can have this continent-wide confederation called the EU in which there is really very little political connection for individuals who live within the member states. And even its ultimate borders don't make any coherent sense because Turkey's out there, and maybe we'll let Turkey in even though they have a Muslim history and we're Christian history, and they have, economic differences across the union, cultural, religious, all of these differences. The EU kind of set out to say none of that really matters. But what if it does? If it does, the very act to push in that direction could, again, lead to a rebound effect. And some of what we're seeing in Europe now, I think, is a product of that.
Yeah, I think the EU has moved, both too fast, and in some cases just gotten into areas of regulation that just would never actually make sense. But at the same time, I don't agree, and I'm not sure you're saying this, that you're right. I think people need to have some kind of tribal affiliation in some sense of that word. I don't think it needs to be national, ethnic, religious. And a good example of that is the globalization, the cosmopolitan elite that some Trump supporters are said to be reacting against. I mean, that's real, which is that, there are Americans who are very well educated and affluent, and they identify more closely with Europeans in the same circumstances, or Asians in the same circumstances, than they do with people in America's heartland. So they themselves are evidence that this kind of tribalization can move along a lot of dimensions. What is starting to happen, interestingly, is the globalization of the revolt against that. I mean, there are Trump supporters who identify with Brexit voters and with Marine Le Pen supporters. So, and in a way, I think, oddly, that points to what may be the most optimistic version of the future, which is that people take some of their their political lobbying and even some of their identification to a transnational level. And just to put one more point on that, I think if trade agreements had truly meaningful labor accords, like if we could start saying, okay, we'll do a trade deal with this much less economically developed country if they will agree to let unions organize, or even to some minimum wage, or to completely ban child labor, or whatever, then you would have policies at the transnational level that, like, Trump supporters could meaningfully engage in. They would see the system of international trade as something that could, in principle, serve their interests. And in the process, they'd be like, they would have some allies internationally. It gets complicated who the allies would be, but I guess I would say transnational tribes are possible. They have tended to form at the elite level first, but I'm not sure we're not going to see more of them. I, of course, don't want them to assume the extreme form of, white nationalist bonding with European neo-Nazis, but I guess I'm suggesting that transnational tribes at various kind of socioeconomic levels could ultimately actually be a moderating force, if that makes sense.
I was with you completely until the moderating force at the end, which I'm more skeptical about. But I think that was really a fruitful way of thinking. I like what you're suggesting, that what you have is a kind of elite level, like what is denounced by Trump type people as, like the elite, globalizing, neoliberal, all these different terms that we use to describe kind of the Davos set. That constitutes an international kind of affiliation, kind of led by Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, and Bruce Springsteen, and Bono, and kind of all these people who kind of respect each other and have a general cosmopolitan outlook. But then you also have a kind of cosmopolitanism of populist reaction to that does transcend borders as well. That might be an interesting and fruitful way to think things through. Don't be surprised if you see a column by me where I try to think it through a little bit. But I would say that still raises for me a lot more anxiety than hope or expectation of moderation, precisely because there isn't any political form in existence yet that can galvanize and give effect to those outlooks. There's more in the former among the globalizing set because of the EU, the UN, all of the things that the left and right populists like to denounce, like the IMF and the World Bank. Those constitute, you could say, the very beginning rudimentary structures of a kind of world government that is oriented by a kind of ideology of globalization. You saw it in Hillary Clinton's leaked statements in her bank speech about a dream about a hemisphere-wide trade zone with no borders and so forth in the Western Hemisphere among the Americas. And so there's more there, although it's still very rudimentary. We also haven't figured out what it would even mean to have a functioning political body that was so large. I mean, how do you get representation in such a thing? But then the fact that we still have all of these nation states that are divided between people who are sympathetic with that and now increasingly lining up against it in a kind of counter ideology that also transcends borders opens up very strange possibilities where you get cleavages across countries internationally that don't work politically. And that points toward a great deal of instability in the future.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's not an inherent feature of global governance or international governance that it serve only the interests of the elite. In principle, you could have a more left-wing global governance, at least from the point of view of some constituencies, like if you had more meaningful labor accords. And the other thing you could do, and I actually made this argument in a book I wrote called Nonzero like 17 years ago, is that if the complaint about labor accords is, or environmental accords for that matter, in supranational trade agreements is, wait, you're slowing globalization down, you're slowing the evolution of technology down, I said, look, that may be a feature, not a bug, for precisely the reasons we've been discussing. I mean, people can only assimilate change at a certain level. So the traditional argument against more leftish forms of global governance, that it may slow things down, I don't think is a killer argument. But my main point is, you can imagine American populists getting engaged with populists in other countries in the common endeavor to actually shape policy at a supranational level. This may be off a few years. It may never happen, but you can imagine it, and I would imagine it being a more constructive venting of some of the energies than we're seeing now. That's
perhaps. I mean, again, I tend to think very much in terms of I'm an admirer also of Pierre Menant, the French political philosopher who's written a lot about these themes in a European context. And he emphasizes a lot the importance of politics, that you actually have to be able to feel as a citizen like you are a part of something in which you have some say that is proximal to you. And nation states already push that pretty darn far because you're pretty small. I mean, each of us as Americans are, one of 800,000 in every congressional district. I mean, it's kind of absurd how little voice we have. But it becomes exponentially harder once you get to something the size of the EU or even larger. And I also worry again about your suggestion of kind of international affiliation among the kind of populist reaction, because if that got in control, what you'd end up with is, I think, something much more like a series of kind of Putinist regimes around the world, and not just Putin, like Chavez when he was there in Venezuela, and Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, all of these kind of strongman, kind of mid-range dictatorships that are out there as another model. Those tend to be the kind of regimes that populist perspective tends to gravitate toward.
But I would suggest that that's partly a function of the main outlet for policy available to these people currently being a national outlet. And if that weren't the only outlet, maybe, this is conjectural, maybe things would be better. But we don't know. But I know you said you had to leave at 1:30, which is where we are. So I guess we need to wrap this up. I wanted to talk about your column about the universal basic income and how it may be naive. I think
we could talk about it a bit.
Yeah. I mean, people could probably almost get the idea. Well, maybe they can. But the point is, money isn't everything. And I mean, universal basic income, of course. You talked about the left-wing version of just giving people more money. I think there's a kind of a slightly right-wing version, which is giving people guaranteed basic income, but then taking away the welfare, the safety net. I think that some people, kind of libertarians, don't mind that so much. But in any event, the general idea is the government would just give people enough to guarantee they have enough money to get by. And your point is, look, jobs aren't just for making money. Jobs are for giving meaning and purpose to your life in part, right?
Yeah, and not for everyone, but I do worry. I mean, that column got kind of misconstrued by some readers who thought that what I was saying was a kind of more standard, like, Republican objection, that, like, if you give people money, they'll become lazy and just sit around and not do anything. And actually, my argument was the reverse, that we are entering a world. I'm certainly, I'm like the 50,000th person to point this out, and I'm reading those other people first, but a lot of people have been concerned that we are entering an age in which work is slowly evaporating, that the number of jobs that will be out there that will pay a decent wage is going down, that first you had technology, technology and globalization kind of pushing, giving downward pressure to manufacturing jobs. That was somewhat compensated for by service sector jobs, and now service sector jobs and manufacturing jobs are going to slowly disappear with the rise of automation and robots and things like this. My concern is that we might be entering a world like that, and that, given that fact, a universal basic income is not an adequate response to it, whereas some on the left say that it would be. I'm just concerned that we're already seeing what a world like that would look like in the kind of the opioid problem that we see in the American heartland right now, where there are a lot of people who are out of work. Some of them are collecting benefits. Some are living on the income from a spouse. Some of them have disability checks coming in, and a lot of them are like in coal communities where coal jobs have disappeared and manufacturing jobs have disappeared. And you would think from some of the rhetoric from the pro universal basic income crowd that you would see these people becoming entrepreneurs and, doing hobbies that benefit themselves, kind of living the Karl Marx dream of hunting in the day, fishing, and then philosophizing at night. And in fact, what you're seeing is not that at all. You're seeing a lot of people, not everyone, of course, but a lot of people who are kind of falling into a trap of trying to find some way to find a kind of compensatory satisfaction in life, a fair number of them, a disturbing number of them, in drugs. Mm-hmm. And that concerns me, that it reveals something that is true, which is, even if Aristotle was right that the ultimate human end is a life of leisure and self-betterment in that leisure, that isn't something that most people are really going to do very well, that's a very rare thing. And that's always the case with Aristotle. It's always, the highest end is always something that is not only high, but rare. Only very few people are going to ever do that. We're not all going to become philosophers when we have, all of our bills paid for. Mm-hmm. So I have no kind of, in its own terms, I have no objection to a universal basic income. I don't think the end result is going to cause people to become lazy layabouts, that, you need a whip over people's shoulder of necessity, making them get out of bed in the morning and hold down work, or they'll just become lazy. I think it's, again, sort of the opposite, that when the jobs disappear, what we need to be doing is using resources to make new jobs. We have to give people something to do. Mm-hmm. I'm drifting in the direction of things like national service, a lot of the programs of the New Deal that put people to work. This country is, Trump, the one thing Trump's right about, infrastructure is crumbling all over the place. Yep. We're a rich country. We could afford to hire thousands, millions of people and put them to work making the country better. And it would be better for many of those people than simply sending them a check and saying, whatever you want to do, go ahead. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. There's a kind of infrastructure program I'd like to see. The conventional wisdom is it's not the kind that Trump is going to generate, but but we can hope for the best. Listen, thank you so much, Damon. Let me say, in addition to, we've mentioned your column at the Week, which everyone should check out. It shows up more than once a week. You also did a good piece, a book review of a book on William F. Buckley recently from the New York Times Book Review, which we can link to. And then you're on Twitter at Damon Linker, right? I assume that handle was not taken.
Yeah, that is it. It's just my name. Yes, exactly. Easy to find, and yeah, the Buckley Review is in the book review this weekend.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Damon.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.